It's good to have Andy Stanley with us today. Andy, welcome.
Thanks, Tony. It's good to be with you, and a Merry Christmas, or I guess that's appropriate to say.
Yeah, it is. We'll make sure this interview gets posted before the holidays. So thanks for joining
Well, you can
us.
wait. You can wait till next Christmas if you need to.
That's right. For those that don't know, Andy's the senior pastor, founding pastor of North Point Ministries here in Atlanta. And Andy, you're about 45 minutes down the road, but we don't get a chance to see each other face to face. So thanks for agreeing to
Yeah,
join us on Skype today.
it's about 3 hours of traffic between us, even though at 2 in the morning we're 45 minutes apart.
That's true. That's very true. Well, the reason I wanted to connect today is I just had a chance to wrap up reading Deep and Wide, your most recent book. And as I shared with you a few moments ago, I've not read everything you've written, but of the books that I've taken in the past, this is certainly my favorite. And so, strong encouragement for those that are listening to check it out, download it, and take a read. But it's within that mind that I had some questions I wanted to ask you today, Andy, beginning with the very front of the book. For the first time, at least I've ever seen it, you go into a lot of detail about the relationship between you and your dad. And I'm just curious to see what prompted you to finally share that in writing.
Well, it's funny because the book is about church, but the first part of the book I wanted to explain how I got into to North Point, or how North Point started. And I wanted to be really clear that I'm not a traditional church planner. I didn't go out knocking on doors and begin with a dozen people. So I had to somehow explain that I started with 800 to 1,000 people. So in telling that story, I felt like I had to explain that I used to work for my dad. I've been in Atlanta for 10 years before we started the church. So I had lots of friends, a big network of people, really trying to make sure I honored church planners to say, my hat is off to you. I did not do what you did. And so I'm not sort of positioning myself as the traditional church planner. So as I'm sitting in my chair, typing out, trying to figure out how to do a short version of this transition from working for my dad to the point where we started North Point, it just started flowing out of me, and it was I think it was very healthy for me to go back, actually 17 years ago. So what started off to be a 2 or 3 paragraphs of transition ended up being an entire chapter of the book. And I just went ahead and just put all the details out there, not sure that it would ever get published. And so, Tony, I don't know if this is interesting. I realized I said so much about my dad in there, so much about our story, I'd need to get permission. The publisher thought it was fine, but I thought, wow, there's no way I'm going to put out, this personal side of our story without clearing it with my dad. So my dad just turned 80, and again, this was 17 years ago. So I took my first version of this story, which is chapter 2 in the book, and I called him. I said, Dad, I'm writing this book, and I wanted to tell a little bit of our story, but I wanted to clear it with you, but I don't want you to read it. I want to come to your house and read it to you, and read it with you, and make sure you're comfortable with this. There's some details I want to make sure I have straight. And I got to tell you, it was one of the most precious times I've ever had with my dad. And partly, it was 17 years ago when I left. I worked for him for 10 years. When I left, things were horrible, horrible, horrible. We have since patched things up relationally, but part of that was we just decided not to talk about the past. It's like, what happened, we're moving on. And so things have been great. But there were some things that he didn't know, that he just couldn't hear me 17 years ago. So I go over to his house, and I read this chapter out loud to him, and we cried and cried. I'm telling you, I just would have to stop. I would just get so teary-eyed. He would cry, and I would cry. And I finally got through it, and we regained our composure. And my question was, Dad, is it okay to put all this in a book? I thought he might say, I don't want to bring all that up, or that's not how it really happened. And he looked at me, he said, Andy, he said, that's exactly how it happened. I think you need to put that out there. That's going to help a lot of pastors, and it's going to help a lot of pastors who have sons or daughters who are in ministry. And so I got his blessing to put the story out there, and so long answer to your short.
Yeah, no, I mean it's great, and a lot of intimate details there that I guess I never expected to see in writing from you, and actually from your father. Then as a result of that, so I appreciate you sharing it. It's almost worth the price of the book just to see that story. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Well, I think for many of us who have kids who are going to not follow in our footsteps necessarily, but hopefully work in ministry, and in some cases work for us, My son, he's between semesters in college. He's working in our finance department right now. And I walk by and I see him sitting over there. And I'm thinking, oh no, I just want to make sure it goes better. I don't want to do anything to sacrifice that relationship. So I do think for fathers and sons, multi-generational ministry families, if I could give them that a chapter of the book, I would. And again, I've heard from so many people who had similar stories and felt like it compelled them to go back and wrap up some things with, just some things that we just leave dangling sometimes relationally. But anyway, that's just one chapter of the book.
Are you at all concerned your son's going to break off and start some rogue CPA firm someplace, Andy?
I tell my kids, hey, I'm going to go help you. Whatever you do, you're not going to get rid of me. I'm just going to go with you. So that would be fine with me.
That's good. That's good. Well, it's interesting you brought up church planters, but I'm curious about how guys that are in positions after they read the book, they realize, oh my word, we have some changes to make, and they're in a place where they're having to transition. And so a couple questions related to that. Number one, if I'm the pastor guy at the church, how do I know I'm the right guy to lead the change? And then if I am, what's my first step?
Well, this sounds like self-promotion, but as you know, Section 5, the book is broken into 5 sections, and Section 5 is written specifically to that question. How do you lead change? And specifically, how do I know if I'm the person to lead change? So in that section of the book, I ask questions like this. I say, are you more problem solver or vision caster? If you're a problem solver, you may lean more toward the management side of things. You may not be the person to lead the change because change is all about vision. I talk about the ability to take criticism, the ability to the risk reward ratio is important. If a person's not willing to take risk, you're probably not the person to lead change. A couple other things. I wrote in the book. Do people follow you? If people aren't following you, you're probably not a leader, so you're gonna have a difficult time leading change. And then, if the people following you, if you secretly wish they would go follow someone else, chances are you're not the person to lead change. And the thing that I push hard at, and I know this is uncomfortable, is leadership is a gift. Now, we can all become better leaders, but then we can all become better singers, and we won't necessarily be singers. And so I think, especially when it comes to leading change rather than managing the status quo, it requires leadership. And I do hope one of the takeaways from the book is that there would be some men and women who read this, and while some are inspired to push harder and lead harder, I hope it inspires some other people to look around and say, you know what? I think I'm called to be a second person or a third person. I think I'm called to step back and allow either a younger person from a different generation or someone who's to my left or my right to lead the change. And that doesn't necessarily mean be the senior pastor or be the primary communicator, but to lead change is difficult. It requires leadership. And I think Section 5 is kind of a gut check for some people. So read it, you've been warned.
Yeah, well, I want to push just a second on that. Are you suggesting that, have you seen some churches where the senior guy really wasn't the visionary to lead the change, but the second chair person was able to see that come, for that to actually work?
Well, let me answer it in a way that we can both relate to and that many of your listeners can. 80% of youth pastors currently think they can lead their church better than true. I mean, all the youth pastors out there, don't you look at the old guys going, good night, if I were in charge. So there is something about next generation leadership that's so important because as the world changes and as culture changes, and hopefully we can talk about that in a minute, it's both the ability to lead, at the same time, it's the ability to relate to the culture that you're leading. And so, there are situations where men and women, mostly men that I know of, are transitioning out of leadership or are stepping not out and aside, but they're stepping aside to allow some new people to lead in some new directions. And I hope this is the kind of leader I am. I hope one day I'm smart enough to recognize it's time for me to step aside and be the wind in the sails of the leaders around me and the next generation leaders. So Section 5, I believe if a group of people, leadership team, will really grapple with some of the questions I asked in that last section of the book, I think the answers to some of the questions they're wrestling with right now will become clearer, and it will be a bit threatening, But my hat's off to the leadership team or the leader who can say, you know what, I'm not the person, this change needs to happen. I'm not the person to do it. I want to help my church or my denomination get where they need to be. So what is my role, even if it's not the point person anymore? And again, we've seen that before in ministry. Both of us have, and we've seen that in business. And when that's done well, everybody wins and everybody's a hero. When it's not done well, churches split, churches spin in the wind, ministries go unfunded. You know, we drive by those buildings and think, wow, sure would be great to repurpose all that property, but you know, the leadership in place is not about to be replaced. And so I think there's some great opportunities around that idea.
So let me talk about specifically North Point, and as you're working to fulfill your vision, how do you make sure that what you're doing today is still effective in accomplishing that mission? Because I suspect, has it been 17 years now, Andy?
17 years.
Man.
Yeah.
You and I are getting old then.
Yeah, I won't ask you how old you are.
So 17 years, I'm guessing there were some things that you did 17 years ago that were great back then that may not be the best thing today. How do you stay on top of that to know if what you're doing is still effective?
2 or 3 things I wrote down, just so your audience knows. You sent me the questions ahead of time, so I'm not as smart as these answers. You're actually prepared for this. One thing, and I've done this intuitively, I don't know where I learned this, is that I am an evaluation freak. We don't just evaluate here. We have a culture that is so about evaluation, and we don't just evaluate failure. We evaluate everything. In fact, you generally don't evaluate if something goes bad. We try to be consistent about doing an autopsy on everything we do, even success, because if you don't know why something's working when it's working, it's impossible to fix it when it breaks. And so when things are going well, as I say to leaders, look, don't just say the Spirit's moving, and don't just say God's blessing. Find out what God is blessing so you can replicate that, document it, and then not drift from it. So we are just crazy about evaluation. And our vision and mission has been so crystal clear from the beginning. We have something to measure against. The other thing that we do, and I talk a lot about this in the book, is in every ministry environment, we use this terminology, clarify the win. Yeah. Clarify the win means you look at your preschool environment, your children, high school, middle school groups, and you ask the question, what's the win? What's the, oh my gosh, we did it, we got it done. What's the win? Let's document that. And let's lean everything into that. So as you clarify the win at every level, you evaluate together as a team. And then when something's not working, you know it's not working. And when something quits working, you quit doing it. Yeah. The thing that the church seems to have the most difficult time doing. And again, for church planners, this is a little easier. You're creating your own systems, your own problems, and your own evaluation system. And you're not locked into a tradition that you're working against. For people in mainline churches or established churches, it's a little bit more difficult. But again, evaluate everything, you clarify the win, you measure your success against the win, and you just refuse to put up with sideways energy where you're. One of the questions we ask a lot is, are we still excited about this? This is the staff. Are we still excited about this? I mean, it's working, people are still showing up, but are we manufacturing excitement, or are we genuinely excited about that? And that's kind of a gut check. That's something that's just a big part of our culture.
So do you have a specific example of something that worked in the past that at some point through the years you decided we need to push the pause button on this and reassess and maybe even stop it?
I made a list of things.
You did?
Yeah, and I didn't have to think very hard. When we first started, we were committed to organic group multiplication. You start a group, meet in a year and a half, split the group, and we still do that. But we grew too fast to assimilate people into a group, so we went to a system where our group multiplication is built around an event called Group Link. Yeah. And Group Link is a big part of what we do around groups. And again, we didn't abandon something, but we realized what we're doing isn't working quick enough. We, for years, did a weekly event called Kid Stuff. About 4 years ago, it dawned on us, Kid Stuff was designed to help parents do a better job at home, but we were putting all our time and money into the event rather than really helping parents. So we went from once every week to once a month, and then put some time and resources into actually helping parents do the things that we originally designed Kid Stuff to do. Early on, we killed our midweek high school ministries. We had Sunday and midweek, and we realized with homework and sports, we wanted the leaders from the high school to be involved. in our student ministry. And the only way to do that was to create the primary event at a time when they could actually come. So we killed our midweek student ministry event. This is important. We've learned that we need to recreate singles ministry every 3 years. Every 3 years, we basically, even when it's working, we kind of shut it down, we rebrand, rename, reconfigure, and the reason is, in a city like Atlanta, and maybe in most cities, the singles culture doesn't change, but the single people do. Because single people don't want to be single. Most of them want to be married. So if every 3 years we start over, what we've learned is we get a new, if I can use the word crop, or a new group of leaders that surface because they want to be a part of something new, and new always creates momentum. So we ran our original singles model too long, and it wasn't not working, but it was one of those things where we just weren't excited about it. So about 3 or 4 iterations in, we realized the goal is to recreate it every 3 years, even if it's working. So that's an answer to that question. We overhauled our entire church planning model 2 years ago. We completely recreated or redid our baby dedication, which sounds kind of strange, but again, it was one of those things where we asked the question, is this really accomplishing what we wanted it to accomplish? So there are probably very few things that haven't been untouched and haven't been tweaked, and in some cases abandoned and recreated. And again, it goes back to this principle that if you want to create momentum, new things create momentum. So sometimes there's value in shutting things down that are even working, giving yourself some time, some space, and relaunching, because a relaunch always creates some kind of momentum. So if we're not enjoying it, and if it's not really doing what something's designed to do, we are not hesitant to shut things down. I mean, that's, again, it's just part of our culture.
Well, let's finish with this, Andy, and I appreciate you. You're taking more time than we originally planned, but this question I think is going to be very important to the church leaders that follow what's happening here on the site. So the question is this: I want to force you to think, and I'm assuming you don't like to think about this, but I want you to think about life at North Point after Andy Stanley. Yeah. And specifically, what I want to get at is, what are you doing today to prepare the next generation of leaders at your church for what life is going to be like when you're not the senior pastor?
Well, I'm not uncomfortable talking about that at all, so I'm glad you asked. One of my goals, actually, is to watch this work without me, because one day it's going to work without me. It's going to work without me because I'm not here. It's going to work without me because I can't be here. Why not watch it work without me while I'm still healthy and can be involved? So one of my goals is to take a year and to be involved as a spectator instead of somebody who's engaged, because one day that day's going to come. I might as well, enjoy it. So there's several things we're doing. About 7 years ago, I met with our elders and I said, I must become less and less indispensable, especially when we went multi-site, because as you know, Tony, there's so many advantages to multi-site. I mean, there's so many. And when you go multi-site, the original site becomes less important, and the talking head actually becomes less important as well, as you guys have learned. Yeah. So I said I need to become less and less indispensable. So that means less preaching. It means making fewer decisions. It means pushing the decision making out to the campus pastors or the lead pastors at our 5 Atlanta area churches specifically, because that's the hub of what we do. It means allowing these guys to take risks. It means that we're not going to do everything the same at every church. We're not going to abandon our model, our mission, our vision. But in terms of letting these men and women make leadership decisions so that we have a strong leadership culture, those are some of the things. I meet with all of our communicators as they create series. I do evaluation. The preaching and teaching piece obviously is central to any local church. And with multiple campuses, there are multiple speaking opportunities. And I absolutely love coaching our communicators, and they get better and better and better and better. So at the leadership level and at the communication level, I'm very engaged. I meet with our core communicators every other Thursday morning for breakfast for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and the agenda is they bring the questions. So that's sort of my empty my cup, can't fill yours, but I can empty mine in terms of just the leadership part. Our leadership structure pushes decisions as far down into the organization as possible, and then at the communication level, I'm becoming more and more a coach. So those are some of the specific things I'm doing, and I look forward to watching it work without me. My favorite Sundays, I'm sure many of your senior pastors who are watching this, some of my favorite Sundays are the Sundays I just drive in here with my family and just watch it work without me. And it's so extraordinarily motivating to me to go, wow, that was an incredible weekend. I didn't have to do a thing. So.
Yeah. Well, here's my concern, though, Andy. I see this. It's working for North Point, but there's a line of thinking. Some of it actually getting to guys' theology about the role of the pastor. You actually allude to this in your book. You talk about God's man, and my concern is if you take that approach to leadership, it doesn't really allow for this transition to the next generation that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's terrible theology. And I grew up in a culture, believe me, I grew up in a culture that was all about God's anointed and God's man and, hear from God. I get that. And if somebody wants to believe that, that's fine. It's just not a New Testament. It's an Old Testament approach to life that we bring into the New Testament because it allows us to stay in control. We get to be the prophet or the priest or the king. Yeah. Paul, he came along and said, no, you're just part of a body. Well, I don't want to be a part of a body. I want to be a prophet or a priest or a king or the anointed one or God's spokesman. But that is not the church. And right. Jesus didn't say, Jesus taught against that. He set the guys down and said, look, don't lead like the Gentiles. The Gentiles lead from the top and everybody there is for them. In my kingdom, the greatest among you will be the greatest servant. And he turned the whole thing upside down. So you take that teaching, combine it with what Paul said about the body of Christ, and there's no room for this, I'm God's man and everything, all the rivers flow in my direction. So it's terrible theology. It's not biblical theology. And it just sets guys up. It sets guys up for personal failure, and it sets a church up for failure long term. So, I just think what John Maxwell said so many years ago, that success is all about succession. It's not just a cute phrase. It's absolutely true. Yep. And the amazing thing is, nobody modeled this better than Jesus.
Yeah.
When he left, the church should have ended with the crucifixion, or even 3 or 4 days after the resurrection. The church should have been out of business. But he left an empowered group of people who understood this, that even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And those guys got that. And they had rock star status for a few months following the resurrection. But never again do you find them arguing about who's going to sit on the left and who's going to sit on the right. Instead, they're serving tables and serving widows and eventually giving their life for this wonderful thing we call the local church.
Yeah, that's a good word, Andy. All right, well, thank you again. You gave us some bonus time today, so I really appreciate that. And again, if you have not read Deep and Wide yet by Andy Stanley, you need to pick that up. You can get it on Amazon or in the, what do the Apple people call their little bookstore, Andy?
iBooks.
iBooks.
Yeah.
I'm just out of it. I'm still working in the Amazon world.
Amazon world's great.
Okay, all right. Well, regardless.
Hardback.
All right, Andy, thank you again for joining us today.